Hi everyone, my name is Amber Ross and I'll be your presenter today. We're going to be covering mandatory minimum sentencing on federal and state level. So, what is mandatory minimum sentences? They are a one-size-fits-all sentencing that's imposed for traditionally drug crimes, but they are reserved for some other heinous crimes. Originally adopted in the 18th century, they've changed over time as crime has developed. In the 1980s, they were changed to focus more on the drug problem. It was an attempt to deter criminals, thinking that these crimes that they were committing would have these automatic sentences. It didn't necessarily work exactly the way that they wanted to, and now we're 2 decades later, and unfortunately there are some instances where people are suffering from these mandatory sentences. They are mainly for, like I said, drug offenses, but Congress has enacted them for other crimes, including certain pornography, and economic offenses. The mandatory sentences basically mean that a judge cannot factor into the sentence the likelihood of the offender's recidivism. The sentences are set by Congress and are almost always as determined by the weight of the drug and the presence of a firearm or not, and that doesn't, if the firearm is licensed or not, doesn't necessarily matter. It can count against the offender if the firearm was licensed, or if they had a license to carry the weapon, is what I mean. So, looking at statistics on the federal level, according to the United States Sentencing Commission, the minimum mandatory prisoners make up more than half of the federal prisons population, and drug-related offenses, particularly drug trafficking, accounted for 2/3 of the total offenses carrying a mandatory minimum in 2016. The next largest category was pornography, followed by firearms, and then sexual abuse. So, moving on, looking at instances where mandatory sentences were more recently adopted and their outcomes. In 1973, New York State implemented the Rockefeller drug laws. They increased the sentences for drug possession, but also, in doing so, they increased the prison population 6-fold with detrimental racial disparities. In 2009, to slow the growth of the prison system, New York removed the law's mandatory minimums for low-level drug offenses. In 1992, Kentucky implemented a series of legislation installing a minimum for drug crimes that occurred within 1,000 feet of a school, while doing nothing to actually protect the school. The law basically covered any urban area that there was a school in, and the racial disparities that it caused with the prison population were excessive. So most leaders in the criminal justice system are torn between the mandatory minimum sentencing pros and cons, the good and the bad. Looking at the good, the intentions of the mandatory sentences are good in a way that they decrease the sympathy during litigation, guaranteeing a uniform judgment. They deter criminal behavior. A criminal is less likely to commit a crime, knowing the absolute punishment. Unfortunately, there's not many other good arguments that can be made with just generally looking at mandatory sentences. If you were to get into individual cases or more in-depth categories, there'd be a bigger debate. The mandatory sentences, they're unjust. They shift the weight of the sentencing toward minorities, and they tend to be unfair and counterproductive to our entire justice system. There is no one-size-fits-all justice. And then that brings us to the victims, Josh Horner. He was sentenced to 25 years for selling his own pills to an informant who befriended him, who gained his sympathy, and this informant used Josh's sympathy because he told him he couldn't pay his rent and buy his prescription at the same time. So Josh helped him by selling some of his prescription medications to him, and he got 25 years for a mandatory minimum. He will actually spend more time in prison than the former Enron CEO, who was convicted of one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in modern history. That's sad. And one of the saddest parts and one of the biggest victims of all of these is the children of the incarcerated parents, the children of any incarcerated parent, but especially those of the mandatory minimums, because they typically start off at 5 to 10 years, and you can imagine how much a child grows in 5 to 10 years. Although the individual serving mandatory sentences suffers, it is the children. It's the devastation to them. Sandra Jones, she was sentenced to prison for her first nonviolent, low-level cocaine charge. Special sentencing enhancements allowed the judge to sentence her for such a brutal amount of time. She was 31 at the time of sentencing, and her mother is now raising her child. But the most astonishing of all would be Brenda Valencia. After giving her unlicensed aunt a kind gesture, a ride, not knowing the circumstances of the ride, just gave her a ride. Her aunt sold 7 kilos to an informant, and because Brenda was the one that moved her aunt from point A to point B, she ended up suffering and being sentenced to 10 years of mandatory minimum. The judge in that case stated that there was nothing about that was fair, but as any judge would be, he was bound by law to follow the guidelines. So, in conclusion, mandatory minimum sentencing is not the answer, and the reform that has recently happened, and some prisoners have actually been released. However, I did not cover that in my presentation here. This is something that we should all be aware of, and decide our points, where we stand individually. Thank you for your time.